There it is. Let me know. And before I hand the floor over to Horace, I just wanted to briefly introduce him to those of you who may not already be familiar with his work. Horace is a professional analyst, and along with mobile computing, one of his primary areas of interest is transportation, and specifically micromobility, which is a term he coined to define mobility that is enabled by a vehicle that weighs less than 500 kilograms, or about 1,100 pounds. Horace has a background in computer engineering and product development, and his career includes years spent as a senior analyst at Nokia, and also time working alongside Clayton Christensen as a senior fellow at the Christensen Institute. Currently, Horace is a co-founder and chief strategy officer at San Francisco-based Bond Mobility, which he describes as the world's fastest and funnest micromobility service. He's an analyst at Asimco, which specializes in software development and consulting services for companies interested in deploying mobile applications. And he's a co-founder of Micromobility Industries, which hosts conferences and creates content around micromobility, including a podcast that explores the disruption to urban transport that comes from new electric lightweight utility vehicles. Along these lines, Horace is also a host of the Critical Path podcast, which contemplates the causality of success and failure in mobile computing and related industries. In short, Horace is a visionary who has spent his career working at the intersection of business and technology, and I'm delighted to have him join us as a BSSE speaker today. Horace, welcome. We're happy to have you.
Thank you, Katie. That's a lovely, very lovely introduction. Yes, it's interesting time to do this, and I'm grateful for all of you for taking the time to participate. So this is influenced and this is the result of the work I did with Clay back in 2015-16, thinking about the future of transportation in general. And so we were looking at automobiles and how they might once again go through a disruption. And so part of that, of course, was the question of energy. I think Clay wanted to do something with energy as an industry. I was more drawn to transportation as sort of one of those elements. But when I started thinking about, are we going to see India emerging? Are we going to see electric emerging? And we're looking at all these candidates for disruption. And I was collecting all the data, trying to sort through that and pick the potential winner, right? Create a hypothesis, a disruptive hypothesis. I was drawing a lot of blanks because it wasn't fitting I thought what the theory was telling us. It was not, there wasn't a shortage of candidates. We had electric drive, we had autonomy, we had sharing or ride hailing, we had communications. These are sometimes called CASE, C-A-S-C, communication, autonomous, self-driving, and electric. And sort of these were the candidates, and everybody was really expecting these to be the big change in the world. And so what I did was what caused me to change my point of view is actually taking a drive or ride on an electric bike, and I was like, wait a minute, where are these vehicles, these small vehicles, being considered for a disruption in the transportation? And then you start to pull on that thread, and you see, oh, there's all these things like electric mopeds. There's these very lightweight golf cart-like vehicles. In China, there were three-wheelers, tuk-tuks, or the kind of these Indian based very lightweight vehicles for as used as taxis. You had Nigerians using motorbikes as taxis as well. And I said, what's going on at the bottom of the market, really below the car? Because we were really trying to find the bottom of the car, but there was a huge gap. So anyway, let me just dive in quickly and tell you why I thought this is very much a theory, perfect for the theory. So let me share one screen here, and let's see if we can dive into some of the wonderful ways that we have to analyze the problem. And so quickly now, can you see this okay? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay. So first of all, the main observation is that cars are not the basis of competition. It's not whether you have a particular form factor that really is what people are buying. But there was a market, but it wasn't a market for machines. It was a market for miles. People wanting to travel, wanting to go places. That was the main job to be done. There were also great over-service indicators. We had cars which were obviously growing in size, growing in capability, far beyond what people could absorb. And so I use this word dead weight because you ended up with like thousands of pounds of additional weight and capability literally baked into the vehicle that went far beyond what people could absorb. And yet the industry kept piling it on. We also had this interesting observation about modularity and integration. It's like in that the car was really a huge bundle. It was not just in the way it was built, but also in the fact that people were hiring it to do a whole bunch of jobs all at the same time. They would use it for groceries, they would use it to go to work, but they also use it to haul things. And and supposedly, with pickup trucks especially, was something that was meant to be a commercial quality vehicle, but it was used for personal use. Same with SUVs, off-road capabilities and things like that, which are very rarely used. But it was about really having this being a bundle of trips all packaged into one vehicle, and that was the premise of the vehicle today. We also had this great observation about competing with non-consumption, where you have in new urban areas, and we'll touch upon this a little bit, the fact that you have 2.5 billion people are going to be urban residents in the next 30 years. This is because of the great emerging market transition away from agrarian to industrialization. We went through this in China. We're going to see more and more of that in India, in Africa, in parts of South America and Southeast Asia as well. And so a lot of those billions of people, which everyone's been predicting for a long time, will become urban citizens. What will that do in terms of providing transportation for them? And finally, there's two more things. We mentioned a little bit about jobs to be done, but also we'll talk about platforms in that sense. But in terms of value chains as well, looking at how the production of micro vehicles is so different than the production of macro vehicles, and questions around the potential for having, let's say, software stacks that are much more rapidly evolving and much more based on essentially the mobile phone as the building block, as opposed to custom hardware built for automotive specifically. So just a few basics about transportation, in case this is, even transportation engineers may not really cite this as the most basic thing, but there are several constants about the industry that I think are interesting. One, we tend to spend about an hour a day in travel. Now this is an average. Obviously there's going to be some distribution, but this has been true for a long time, and it's a heuristic, or I should say, an empiric observation. We have about an hour a day. We make about 3 trips a day. The average trip is 20 minutes. And this is really consistent across a lot of the cultures of the world. It doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter when you live. This was true 20 years ago. It was also true 200 years ago. We just didn't have the same machines. So the radius we would be able to travel within an hour changed dramatically. So now we are living, with vehicles that can go much further in that time. But also they're constrained to a large degree by traffic, which is interesting that now that you have a constraint, people are actually asking themselves, maybe I should live closer to my destination, because I'm going on average, instead of 60 miles an hour, I'm going 30 or even 20. Famously, like Manhattan is now the average speed of traffic during the middle of the day is closer to walking speed. So we're going back to pre-horse days. In some urban cores. Also London has the same dilemma. And so there's these observations about what the demand is, how far we are willing to go, how our cities are built, and the fact that really on average we don't go very far. The trip distance distribution shows that 80% of trips are less than 12 miles, 50% are less than 10 miles. And actually, when you look at 20, 30%, we'll get into some of this. Actually, let me pop into this. This is just for New York, and it's only taxis, admittedly, far more a short distance, but nonetheless a car. The most common trip distance is actually 1.5 miles, which is like 20% probability. And the next most common distance is the 1 to 1.5 mile. These are half-mile bins. You can see the distribution towards zero is very heavily skewed, and hardly any trips are made over 10 miles. And that's New York City. But if you look at the entire United States car, traveling public, which is, by the way, the U.S. is like 250 million cars, and there's everyone in the United States, urban, rural, doesn't matter. This is how the distribution goes. And there, it's not quite 1.5, but the most popular trip distance, these are 1 mile bins, is 3 miles. The most common trip distance is 3 miles. And the second most common is 2 miles. And so it's clearly like if you took only 0 to 5 miles, you'd actually be looking at a nearly a majority. In fact, if you did this as a cumulative distribution function, so the graph here at the bottom in blue was, we just saw that number in the previous bar graph. And here's, if you add things up, the way you would read this is you would see that 50% is, again, about a little bit under 4 miles. So that's how much more common the short distances are. And then you can do another thing. You can sort of create a bigger bin here, 0 to 5, 5 to 10. So we got the 5s, the 10s, the 15s, and the 20s. And you see that, again, in terms of actual trips, there's nearly 100 billion trips in the United States less than 5 miles. Yes, there are plenty of long distance trips. If you sort of summed up everything about 25 miles, you do end up with nearly twice that. But let cars take care of the very long distances, but let's sort out the very bottom. So this was the kind of, this analysis allows you to think in terms of what is P, what is performance. And when you create a vehicle today, you're creating it for high speed, right? We're looking at horsepower figures, whether it's electric or not. It's going to be, driving as much performance as possible. We're seeing vehicles easily capable of doing over 100 miles an hour. They can exceed the speed limit in like 3 seconds. They're able to range hundreds of miles. Even if they're electric, we're just putting more and more batteries in there to make sure that they get us hundreds of miles, even though we typically only go 5 miles on average. And so what it's as if the entire energy of the industry, all the great minds, all the great capital, all of the assets are being deployed in this high end of the market, right? The 25s and 30 and above, long distance trips at high speed is what everybody's trying to solve. And yet the demand is at the bottom. It's almost, we have a perfect asymmetry between what people are doing, what the job is, and what people are investing, and therefore where people are supplying the market. So when you get to this kind of observation, it's like a light bulb comes on. You're saying, okay, we have the wrong P. We've been focusing on cup holders and horsepower and not focusing on short distance and traffic, which are the things I think most people suffer from. Is how do you deal with the short distance trips? And it doesn't really help that people are, city advocates and others are saying, well, you should use public transit or doing things that are really not comfortable and are not addressing the entire problem of A to B, because most people are very widely dispersed, and public transit doesn't address all the endpoints of most journeys. And so there's this problem of sharing what is essentially a limited resource. And so the car presents you with this alternative of being personal transportation. Optionality is huge. Go, you can get in and go anytime, but then you're stuck in traffic. So anyway, it seemed like the solution was looking for, we were looking for the wrong solution. So quick word on this overservice indicator, the market for miles. Today I see this sort of being served with boxes or vehicles which are hired for the job as a purchase. So you buy the product in advance, you finance it, you are expected to pay and maintain it, you insure it, you fuel it, you do all these extra costs with it. And it gives you this optionality, like, yeah, you can go anywhere, anytime, except, if you don't have parking, you're not going anywhere. But basically, the idea is that you're buying miles with a box. You're not buying the real job. You're buying a thing that enables that job to be done. So the trip is the hole in the wall, and the car is the drill. Somehow we're offering a lot of drills. So given that, again, here's another angle on the whole question. Let's look at weight as, if you start with a clean sheet of paper and ask yourself, well, what is the problem? The problem is moving people. For now, although people are pulling micromobility into goods as well, obviously for short distance deliveries, things like that, that's certainly possible. But I started with a question of personal transportation, moving people, not goods. If you look at the payload, what is a person in terms of weight? These are the weights of people in different continents. I didn't realize there was this much difference, but sure enough, you know, North Americans weigh more than Europeans, and Europeans weigh more than Asians. And on average, the average human weighs on the world 62 kilograms. The average North American is 81 kilograms. Now, let's take that high end of that spectrum, the North American weight, and then let's add something to it. Let's add bags and other things that people have usually with them. Even if you have, let's say, a passenger, usually as a percentage of the time, let's round that up to 100 kilograms. So basically 220 pounds is the payload. This is what you need to transport to get people moved around. This is the fundamentally as an object, this is what it would cost. But then when you look at vehicles, let's start with the low end of the vehicle. The bicycle is only 15 kilograms on average. Again, it varies between 8 and 25. 25 is more for an electric version. But when you have a vehicle that weighs that much less than the payload, you're saying, well, that's pretty cool. That's pretty efficient. That seems like an ideal situation. If actually you did the same for trucks, though, you'd realize that the truck weighs less than its payload. So it's very normal for trains, airplanes, maybe not airplanes, that depends on the fuel loading. But basically, generally, when you're designing a system for efficiency, you expect the payload to be greater than the vehicle. You don't want to move vehicles around. You want to move things around, and the vehicle is a means to do so. But when you look at the way the cars are actually on average in the United States today, 1,800 kilograms. And this is the dotted line that is sort of in the middle of the graph here. And then you see different car types. So from the compact car to the large truck or SUV, and you're seeing sort of the ranges up to 3,000 kilograms, or about 6,000 pounds. That is how far up you go. And at the very bottom, you're looking at, really 1,200 kilograms as the smallest, like a smart car, a very tiny car. And the passengers, this solid line at the bottom, you're saying that the weight of the passenger is such a tiny fraction of the weight of the vehicle. So how did we get to build such inefficient ways of moving people around over time? I mean, this is what we ended up with. How do we get there is the question, because early cars were not this heavy. So this is an evolution. Of course, safety is cited and all these other things. But again, safety is built because the cars go fast. So why do they go fast? Because they have to go far, but going far is not the problem. So you have this circular argument. We end up wearing armor to go into battle when all we need to do is get around. Why are we burdening ourselves with so much excess? And so that when you look at it from a fuel point of view, only about 3 to 4, I forget exactly, but some like single-digit percentage of the energy stored in the fuel that we burn goes to move the vehicle even, and so the payload itself is like, it doesn't need 300 horsepower and 3,000 pounds. So if you measured the difference between the weight of the vehicle and the weight of the passenger as kind of the what's called the deadhead weight, it's like basically to have a 500 kilogram vehicle, we would reduce the deadhead weight by 77%. So this gets to the point of what I define as micromobility. Micromobility, I defined it as anything below 500 kilograms. This is roughly, again, 5 times the payload. So if payload is 1 person, but that could also mean that you can take 5 people in a vehicle and basically be one-to-one with between the payload and the vehicle weight. Notice that, however, we're like half of the minimum vehicle weight. There's nothing in right now between 1,000, roughly, let's say 1,200 kilograms, and and the bicycle. There's motorcycles, but still they're very far at the bottom. There's a huge gap there. And I simply wanted to draw attention to the vast chasm that exists between small vehicles that seem to be very good at these short distances, but are not very powerful, and these super powerful vehicles that are over-serving. And somehow we have this giant gap in the middle, which I think will be filled. And so highlighting it with weights and arithmetic of efficiency of payloads. There's that argument. Okay, so that's kind of over-serving on weight and understanding the causality there. Bundling and unbundling. This part is about understanding, again, miles and the way how we came to this bundling of transportation. Um, you know, when the world was young, 100 years ago, the car was seen as an integrated solution. What used to be, you had the options of going places. You could walk, you could take a tram, you could take a carriage, which was a horse-drawn. You could take a train, which was steam-powered, or you could take a ship, which was a steamer, also steam-powered. So a little over 100 years ago. And there were all these options. People were getting around. Plenty of transportation was taking place. We had even telegrams to send each other, you know, things at the speed of light, like we had the Victorian internet. So we had a network of trains that actually carried people long, and as well as options for trains that were taking people short distances, different gauges, and so on. So the problem was that it wasn't that the car really came in to say we're better than trains. Actually, for long distances, they were not better than trains, because trains, there were no roads for long distance car travel. They weren't better than trams inside cities, because you had essentially subways already, and certainly couldn't go across oceans. So the car solved really was that they bundled a lot of trip optionality and said, okay, you can go far, or you can go carry 5 people, or you can carry 1 person. So there was a lot of this like bundling that was going on, and it made a lot of sense for an economy and a world that was looking to get out of the, you know, urban environments that people had been in for centuries. In that sense, what we're proposing here is sort of a reversal in the unbundling, because we have now more interest in efficiency around short distances. So if I may just sort of give this perspective here, the unbundling logic here is small distances in small vehicles, large distances in large vehicles. We kind of already do this. The largest of vehicles typically for us are airplanes. We don't mind getting on an airplane to go far. In fact, we increasingly are using these for even a couple of 100 miles, which used to be driven or taken by train, and now even Europeans are flying across the continent of Europe. But at the very small distances, we kind of are over-serving with the car, and I think this is where the optionality is going to come in. And we're seeing it not just in Asia, but we're seeing it not just in the US with scooters, but we're also seeing it e-bikes in Europe really taking off. So this is the foundational logic. The unbundling is coming. Over service on distance, over service on weight. And now about non-consumption. How do we move 7 billion people? And that is 7 billion urban citizens, which will be the case in about 2050. Understanding the city as your customer, understanding the city as the segmentation, where you think about not you know, consumers buying, but also cities acting as the kind of the designer of transportations. We have in the world 1,600 plus cities with more than 300,000 inhabitants. There's one city, it strikes me, that actually is not on this list, which is yet a capital of a country. The Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, has less than 300,000 inhabitants. Now we would think that that should be there. It's an important city, but yet it doesn't even make this cutoff. So imagine 1,600 cities bigger than that. That is the market, as I see it, for large urban centers that need to be thinking about how to serve their citizens. So many times when I talk to micromobility companies, they're looking at cities and asking themselves, and they have large teams, sort of the government relations teams, that are actually the salespeople. It's a B2G market increasingly. And that requires you to think about the job to be done for cities. It requires you to think about how to market a product which you used to market to consumers, as we well know, the sort of the way cars are marketed. But now we're sort of thinking about a private business marketing to cities for solutions that also deliver a consumer experience. And just to illustrate this, if you do the segmentation also by income, sub-segmenting by income, you have low income, medium income, and high income. This is again United Nations definition of income, which actually is pretty. I think that between low and medium, it's like less than $500 a year, and between mid and high, it's less than $1,500 a year. It's not a lot of money. We're talking in distinction here. But you can see how the dark orange area is the future, and the yellow is the present, or the past. And we're seeing just how much medium income grew, and that's mostly China. We have now 3 billion people in middle income, and then the high income is saturating, and so yet there's a little bit of growth. And so when you look at these, 2.5 billion people will have 5 billion medium income people, and you ask yourself, how will they be mobilized? Now you could argue, well, let's just give them all cars, and I don't think that's actually a difficult thing to do. It's in fact the easy thing to do is to crank up the manufacturing of cars. As we all know, the auto industry is very effective at adding capacity. And in fact, if you look at motorization, which is a percentage of the populations under these income groups that have a car today, in other words, how many cars per capita? Low income, it's at 9%, medium income 13%, and high income at 60% as of 2019 or so. And then if you say, okay, what if these grow? Actually, what if we hold high income steady, but you go medium income to 25 and low income to 15, multiply these motorization rates or these attach rates to the number of people, and you're going to end up with this kind of size of the global fleet of cars. From 1980 to 2018, we had 140% growth, where we ended up adding 1 billion cars to the world's fleet, right? So we went from under 500 million cars to 1.5 billion, or roughly actually 1.4 billion today. If we were to multiply an attach rate that I just mentioned, by 2050, we're going to double yet again the number of cars in the world to 1.5 billion more cars. We ended up close to 3 billion cars. Now, again, I think the industry can pull this off, but there are a lot of questions about the environment. In fact, I would even put aside that, and that is probably the biggest constraint. But if you were to look at it differently, is what about parking? Because if people have the cars, they need to store them. And this is one of the hidden costs of car ownership. A car is only used 4% of the time. So 96% of the time, it's staying stationary. Now, it's going to stay stationary at home. It's going to stay stationary at work. It might stay stationary at a shopping or other location. And as a result, the city has to provision storage for the car 3 times at least. In the US, we're actually 8 times. So there are 8 parking spots per car. If you think about how that could scale to emerging markets, how that could scale to countries where land is scarce, then you start to say, okay, how much land mass would we need in order to serve the global population of car owners? And literally, this is the size. We would need Poland as a parking lot. I mean, the whole country of Poland. I've driven across Poland. It's a pretty big place. Today, we dedicated Bangladesh as a parking lot. We would have to add Malaysia. We would have to add Tunisia, and that's how much. Now, I say, okay, fine. We can say, well, surely, it's distributed. We can afford it. But don't forget, this is urban real estate. This is the most valuable real estate on the planet. Trying to cram cars into cities that would make them bloated and large, and you'll be driving by parking lots all the time, as you do today in Los Angeles. I don't think the world will be willing to spend this money on this land which is a finite resource to store cars. Now you can argue, well, what about sharing? Well, yes, but you have issues with what do you do with the cars when it's not shared? How are you actually going to deal with congestion? How are you? So far, the data seems to show that car sharing is actually increasing congestion. What about autonomy? I know many people have cited that as the solution, but again, if everybody needs to go to work at the same time, how do you deal with an autonomous fleet that has to be bursty in its behavior? Nobody even knows if it's possible to deliver on this promise, just technically speaking. But there's a lot of issues involved in trying to overcome this situation on a global scale. Again, over 1.5 billion cars today, that last 14, 15 years. And that's another thing about car industries, that it goes and iterates slowly. It goes over 15 years between when a car is conceived to when it's developed, when it's put in the field, and then it gets taken out of use. It's actually probably 15 is an understatement. I think the average car in the United States is now like something like 10 or 11 years old. And I don't know the distribution, but it's very likely you have half as much, half the cars above that as you do below it. So it could be we're dealing with 22-year-old cars. Not uncommon to see that. Um, that would mean today a 2000, a 2000 model year car, and I'm sure there are plenty of 2000 model year 2000 cars around. So the problem is that we have obsolete technology in cars. We have to sort of force people to get rid of them if we want to cycle through that. And so cars that are made today, as I'm pointing out, many of the cars made today will be around in 2040. And trying to get those cars off the street, if they're polluting too much, if they're obsolete, that will be a challenge. As the auto loans will be already, that's another whole different disaster. Now, the interesting quick observation here is that the U.S. is actually a weird market. The U.S. Was lagging in terms of the low end of the market, as we think of it, as either cycling or even e-bikes or these small quadricycle type vehicles, or sometimes they're called neighborhood electric vehicles, sometimes they're called rural vehicles. The French have a name for them, voiturette, or these things in Japan, they're called K cars or KEI, which means the really small cars. The Chinese have the rural vehicle, which were electric, but usually lead acid. There's a lot of weird things happening below the car, quote unquote, and the US was simply absent out of that market. And it looked like, if you looked elsewhere about 3-4 years ago when I started looking at this, it looked like the US was lagging behind because the US was such an auto-centric culture. But weirdly, the US actually started with the e-scooter sharing. And this came as a surprise in 2017, 18, when, although the idea didn't quite originate there, I think the very first shared e-scooter company was in Singapore. But the US really got it capitalized, and we had Bird and then Lime quickly ramping up. China had gone the route of shared pedal bikes or regular bikes. Europe had gone also shared, but not free floating. So there had been many experiments along the way. And even the US, of course, City Bike in New York and other places were station-based bike sharing and so on. But the scooter thing really caught people's imagination because it was easy to use, especially for the young who are used to scooters. It was throttle-based, not pedals. The vehicles were being managed through a crowdsourced workforce. There were a lot of clever tricks to make that operational, and as a result, it looked like, at least in the initial markets, that it was a viable business. And so the U.S. kind of leapfrogged a lot of the alternative modes of micromobility very quickly, and now pretty much everyone's looking to the U.S. for kind of where the innovation is going to be. And the innovations that are happening on the vehicle side, innovations on the software side, innovations on the service side, and we'll see some ups and downs there. Bearing in mind, of course, that we are in the middle of a crisis, that we're also probably going to see a flame out of a lot of companies, as we did with the dot-com era. This feels like, either the mobile phone industry in the 1990s or the internet industry in the late 1990s. A lot of these things that were clear winners, people are really excited about, a lot of money poured in, and a lot of them failed. And we did, however, see survivors, which carried on to become the largest companies in the world. And that's your Facebook and Google and Apple and Microsoft that are today the largest companies, and Amazon as well. So a lot of the logic was early. The bets were made, and we ended up with consolidation. Um, but generally, just let me give you an idea of how explosive this growth has been. This is just bike sharing. This is from NACTO, National Association of City Transport Officials. So they publish this every year, reports saying what are the ride volumes for. This was bike sharing. So in 2015, we didn't have scooters. We only had bikes. You can see that bike sharing. This is your city bike, or your in Boston, it's forgot exactly the name, sorry, but it's the same company. It's Motivate that ran these services, and then most of them in the U.S. And then we end up with, like, okay, then boom, 2016 comes, another nice notch up there in terms of volumes, and then 2017 comes. Oh, we have to sort of expand the scale a little bit. 2017, but what we have added to the mix is dockless bikes, and these were effectively the copies of the Chinese bike sharing system. So late 2017, this all started. And if I were to then show you what happened 2018, notice that, we have some e-bikes, which are basically the Jump product. And instead of seeing growth in the station systems, we see growth with dockless. And then we have, dockless e-bikes are there as well. Station e-bikes are Motivate with electric motors. But actually, it's gone off the scale right now, because if I zoom back out here, this is what it looks like. Scooters added in 1 year as much capacity as it took 10 years of bike sharing to grow. Obviously, I don't have data for 2019 yet. I believe it grew not quite as much, but it did grow from the year before. So we ended up with really a discontinuity in terms of the growth curve. A lot of that is fueled by, capital. It's not a profitable business, but nonetheless, the economics are interesting. And I want to highlight quickly the economics versus car sharing. This is the scooter sharing economics from Bird versus Lyft and Uber. And because there's no driver, you'll see how it's a slightly different cost structure. There's depreciation, which is a large element here in gray that does not exist it exists on the behalf of the car driver, but it doesn't exist on the balance sheet of Lyft or Uber. You're also seeing no driver, and therefore there isn't this need to pay someone to carry people. So it's still, this suggests that it's positive. It's with a particular vehicle that Bird introduced late last year, and the whole bet now is on having a vehicle that depreciates more slowly, therefore it's more robust, and that they can maintain some pricing power going forward, and the competition is going to be less. Hopefully, maybe Lime will not make it. A lot of things are still up in the air, but the logic of these vehicles, and in fact, it was even Lyft owns Motivate now, and they claim also that their bike business economics are slightly better than their car business economics. And one more thought, finally, I think we're just about at the limit here. The micromobility is not an invention. It's all using off-the-shelf technologies. It's got that thing going for it that I think also Clay would have said is good, which is that it's not a moonshot. It doesn't require you to spend years in R&D, hoping for a miracle, hoping for a breakthrough in terms of core technology. In fact, it uses previous breakthroughs. It uses lithium ions and GPS and cellular networks and smartphones, all of which were developed using billions of dollars of R&D. It's using balancing and other things that had been miniaturized. Electric motors have been miniaturized, and so on. All of this is on the shelf, commoditized, had been developed decades ago. They put it together with a clever business model. And so now we're still in the throes of a lot of questions about viability, but I'm going to just skip quickly to this type of graph here, which shows the growth of the bike sharing businesses. You probably have seen graphs like this for coronavirus. I was first in showing stuff like this, basically on a log scale. you're seeing the growth rates, which are significantly faster for micro than we did for car sharing. And so here we have Uber and Lyft versus Bird and Lime and Tier as well. And yeah, it's still early days. This is less than 2 years into this game, but in those 2 years, they're actually growing twice as fast as the car guys did when they launched car sharing as a disruption, or at least a potential one. So anyway, that's my story. A lot of little details here, but happy to sort of take it into a Q&A phase right now.
All right, if anyone has any questions, raise your hand. Actually, here, I'm going to unmute everybody.
Yeah. I think it's fine. Or I think depending on if it's for example, like 200 meters, then we could have there. Whatever.
Oh, sorry, hold on. Let me. All right. Rachel, you have a question?
Sure. Hi there. Thanks very much, Horace. Great talk. I wondered, just on the last slide you put about the motorcycle anomaly. Why do you think that has not taken off more than it has?
Yeah, sorry. I didn't actually dwell on that, and this was part of a longer talk I gave. The motorcycle is a strange beast, and it has to do with I think a historic strangeness about it. One thing I point out is that if motorcycles didn't exist today, they would not be allowed to exist. Meaning that here's a very powerful vehicle, very hard to use, very dangerous, has no airbags, has no crumple zones, is able to mix it up with vehicles on the freeways that are going, very high speed. Um, and it certainly would not be permitted. In fact, when you look at the introduction of a new mode today, whether it's a throttle-based scooter or e-bike, they're speed limited and power limited. They're always about trying to keep them from going too fast, certainly keeping them off of divided highways. But the motorcycle kind of, because it was born actually about the same time as the car, probably even earlier, it kind of has been grandfathered and persists to this day. But it is used primarily recreationally in advanced markets, although not so in India. And it has great potential in India to becoming actually the de facto micromobility vehicle, especially if it's electrified, if it's made a little bit more easy to use. So in some ways, I'm very interested in the motorcycle because it is such an anomaly, and I'd like to understand it better. It is very, very weird that, for example, it's almost 100% male in the United States. Very few women ride it. It's considered to be some kind of a I don't know what the word should be, sort of like a toxic masculinity problem, because most riders are really just endangering themselves. And yet, it's got the right architecture for dealing with urban transportation. It's not used that way. It's used on freeways or country roads. The Harley Davidson, weekend cruiser. And maybe in Europe, people would do more of the racing with them and so on. So it's a very odd vehicle, but it needs to be thought again as an urban vehicle, in which case really we should look at scooters. I mean, meaning not the mopeds, the Vespas, these sit-down vehicles, which actually many women do ride in Europe, which I think are very comfortable and practical. So those electrified would make wonderful micro-mobility vehicles. We have several startups that are doing electric mopeds in urban environments. I know there was one in Paris. It may still be there. There's Miami is served by US Revel, I think, Revel, and in New York as well. And so there are companies that are kind of like trying to figure that out. And so pluses and minuses. It's like in many ways this feels like the early mobile phone market, and we're sort of arguing over whether, you know, a flip phone or a car phone or a brick or what are the right configurations. We don't yet have the iPhone, so we don't quite know what's the ideal form factor and user experience. So we're experimenting a lot, and in some ways the motorcycle is kind of like, you know, the portable typewriter. We're trying to figure out how the heck can that inform us about the laptop, you know, and you know, it sticks around for decades. People kind of know it, but it doesn't resonate quite yet. So yeah, I'm intrigued by it, and I like to understand the jobs fundamentally. I just think that having been such a legacy for such a long time, the job became so removed from practicality that we are blinded by it somehow.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
We'll go to Liz and then Bob. Let me unmute you, Liz. All right.
Hey, Horace, thanks so much for the presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. So I found the way that you presented the two different dimensions of the vehicles to be really compelling. So first talking about the size and the payload of the vehicle, and then the ownership, so whether it's owned or shared. And in my understanding, the theories were pretty clear on the size and payload and what we can think about there and the potential for disruption. It's less clear to me on the ownership piece, so owning a vehicle yourself or sharing it. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts as to how to think about that one moving forward.
Yeah, I've been very agnostic about sharing versus ownership. This is why the definition does not, you know, does not stipulate whether it should be one or the other. Especially now with the virus problem, people are saying that what's problematic with micromobility is the sharing aspect because you know, hygiene and all that. But in fact, you know, in New York, you know, cycle use has gone up 60%, mostly because people don't want to ride in transit, or maybe car sharing is also coming down. And also it's a fresh air activity. It's personal and so on. So yeah, I'm not convinced that sharing is essential. What I do appreciate about sharing, this is important, is that it's far more accessible, meaning that it is available to you more often than having, you know, especially if you're doing multiple modes. There's an old saying in the phone business that the best camera is the one you have with you, which is why the best camera is the one in your phone. Even though it's a tiny lens, and even though for years and years it was really a crummy camera, but now it's actually becoming some of the best pictures are taken with it. But generally, because there were billions of them in use, it ended up being the most popular camera. Well, if the best bike in the world is the one you have at home, but it is at home and it's not where you are, maybe you got to work a different way, maybe you're in a place where it's the bike is not with you, then the best bike is the one that is nearest to you, and that might be a shared bike. So in that sense, to me, that I call that accessibility. The thing about sharing is that it makes it possible to do versus not possible, even though it isn't great. Now, some people might say, well, I'm going to change behavior and I'll take the bike with me always. And maybe the evolutionary cycle. One of the problems I think also is a fleet vehicle is likely to be used more often, replaced more often, get smarter more often, whereas a personal vehicle may become an appliance and then ends up frozen in time. So you're going to ride a 5-6-year-old bike, no problem, but a 5-6-year-old shared bike might actually be far obsolete by then. So we'll have to see whether the sharing world evolves into becoming smarter. And I don't mean just having more computers on board, but also having services and having gamification and having exercise options and having platforms and having coupons and all these other things that we might end up layering on top of a shared platform, which allows that suddenly to become something that's addictive more and more. And people are like saying, I'm going to get more. One example actually is Bird has launched a payment service. So if you're a Bird user, you can use Bird points or whatever they're called, I don't even know, to pay for your coffee and things like that. That's their attempt to kind of become more than just utility. And as that happens, the same thing happened to the phone, where it went from being a communications product to being your window to the world, to being, you know, games and all these other things. And we call these platforms, we call these ecosystems. And so that means third-party developers get engaged. So if Bird were to someday open up its APIs and say, hey, we welcome everyone, by the way, you know, you can layer on top of this thing a commerce platform, you can layer on top of this thing an exercise platform or whatever, a game platform, have at it. And if that happens, then people might actually discover new jobs to be done on shared. It's less likely to happen on personal. This is only because personal will not get utilized as much and will not get swapped out as often. One of the reasons the phones do work as a platform is because every 2 years to 3 years it gets swapped out, and you're not stuck with like a television or refrigerator, which is decades old. And so you can push the envelope of what can be accomplished. Does that make any sense? I mean, it's a tough argument to make, but I'm trying to figure it out whether this thing actually evolves beyond utility. And I keep telling people that unless it does evolve beyond utility, then it's not that interesting, because it needs to take on the roles that the car has been wanting to take on, of sort of being paid for journeys, being paid for jobs, being paid for other things than delivering people. In fact, you know, the dollars per bit of telephony or data communications has gone to zero, and we're paying for other things instead, right? We have advertising models, we have service models on top of these platforms, where the utility has kind of become commoditized. Another way of looking at it is like, although I said it's a market for miles, if the dollar per mile actually goes to zero, it could happen. It would be then replaced by new monetization strategies on top. Rerouting people to interesting places, getting paid for redirecting people, the way Google gets paid. Google gets paid because you don't go where you think you're going. You're going to go to somewhere else. So imagine you're on the scooter or on the bike and you say, I want to go to this bar, or I want to go to this to even home, but on the way you're suddenly tempted to go elsewhere because it knows something about you, knows something what's on the way, and then it redirects you. Well, that's the way internet traffic is dealt with today. We're not thinking that physical traffic can happen this way because it's so darn expensive. But if we can make it cheap enough, then we can start playing games with it, and that's what's really exciting.
Great. All right, Bob, you had a question? Oh.
Horace, great talk. A couple things. One is you know, totally agree with how the cars and automotive business has over-engineered kind of for its uses. But the reality is that struggling moments kind of are the seed for all kind of innovation to get this adopted. And so the reality is, what policies do you think cities need to create? Because I don't actually believe that cities have jobs. I believe people have jobs. But the thing is that cities can actually create struggling moments by either restricting traffic or increasing the price to park, or like, what are the things that they can actually do to actually then cause struggling moments to make people switch to kind of this lower end alternative?
Great. So, you know, that you're taking it to the next level, right? I simply observe that cities are in the decision loop here, and you're right, they don't have jobs. Although city planners and city managers and city
They do.
people
The mayor
themselves
has a job,
have jobs. I mean,
Yep.
yeah, the mayor has a job. But you do want to sort of think about what is the society's job, if that's possible. But the struggling moment, this is what I observed again personally when I live in Boston. I have lived here many decades, and it's just the traffic got worse and worse and worse. I think some data recently some data set pointed out that Boston is actually the worst city in America as far as traffic, in terms of hours wasted sitting in it. When you think about the struggle, the individuals are now facing. In fact, this was pointed out to me in closer to Cambridge, let's say Lexington, Arlington areas. There are mayors asking whether their economic growth is being hampered by traffic. That it's becoming so gridlocked that they're asking whether they're missing out on what should be available. So in that sense, there's the environmental job, which I think is a bit altruistic, and certainly there's a lot of questions about what you can do to make the world a better place. and of course, lower, pollution levels and things like that also come into play locally. But I focus on parking because parking and traffic, I should say. But parking is one of the things that cities understand well, and they actually now provide a subsidy for. The subsidy for parking is in the idea that you have a minimum number of parking for every establishment, and it's gotten so grotesque to the point that, like, a gym that wants to open a yoga studio has to add parking spaces. Yep. Because the zoning regulations are such that if it's based on how many tables are in your restaurant, based on how many people are using your facility, you have to allocate parking. This is a throwback to the sort of 50s when these laws were written. And as a result, that's valuable real estate. So if someone can go to a city and say, if you change your zoning laws, you realize that if you got rid of some of that parking, you could redevelop that land either for people housing, but also for commercial real estate. And then, some developer will create billions of dollars of value and pay taxes and all these other things to create value. All you have to do is change the minimum requirements for parking. In Europe, they're going the other direction. They're not saying parking minimums, they're saying parking maximums. So if you have 30 apartments in the building, you might only allocate 15 parking spots, forcing people not to have a car, because no parking, no car.
That's right. So here's the thing: is they have to go against like they're at the high end of the market, and the high end of the market wants to continue to go up market. And the reality is what they have to do is to go against the market to actually then enable people at the lower end of the market to move up. And so part of this is that the cities have to realize, like, they're going to have to do things that are, quote, unpopular. But the reality is that are actually creating struggling moments, so they'll actually adopt a new technology. I think the other half of this is they're doing that, but not offering what they can do in its place. So, like, I can actually restrict parking spots, but how am I supposed to get there? Right. And so the whole notion is if I don't have, like in Detroit, we're literally taking the lanes and making lanes for basically bikes, electric bikes and scooters alongside the other thing, because at some point we have so much infrastructure here and not enough people that we can actually do that in the meantime. And so that's what we're trying to do, is actually rethink the way that we're putting the roads. So we're going to actually make traffic worse. And there's a full lane that's wide open, that's a bike that actually will move faster than basically the traffic.
And I'm not an expert. I just follow a few who explain or try to argue this case that actually where bike lanes exist, people stop more often. They actually use the street, the shops more, and economic activity improves actually when you install a bike lane. Also because even though it looks like it's empty, the throughput of those lanes is faster. I'm not an expert on this, but I'll just say that the arguments that people are making are exactly along the lines of, like, well, how do we demonstrate to the stakeholder, to the city shop, the shops and so on, that this is beneficial?
Well, I think the other point is, I think Rachel brought it up, was about sharing. And I think the aspect here is that on the sharing side is, I think we just have to learn to share more as a society. And so we're just learning to share music and real estate and, with timeshares and I think the thing is we're just too immature of a society at this point to actually know how to share more and more effectively. I think that's one of those things, at least here in the United States. I think we have to learn how to do that. I don't think that's, it's not as popular as, if you will, as it has been in Europe.
And that's the thing in Europe and Asia. And so my hope is that there's existence proof. Somebody said, the future is here, but it's unevenly distributed. A lot of the questions are other places leading? Where does the US lead? And I think US is leading in software and actually business model innovation. But in Europe and other places, they're leading in terms of decisions by cities, and they're also leading in terms of behaviors and normative behaviors. So at some point, some cross-pollination has to happen. It's easy for the Americans to export their business models, not so easy for Europeans to export their cultural models.
Yes, that's
but
right.
There's learning going on.
That's right. Well, and the one last comment is around Harley Davidson. It's a $5 billion or plus $5 billion organization, and it is not a functional job at all. It is a social and emotional job all the way.
Absolutely right.
You start to realize, like, at some point it's over-engineered because it has social and emotional jobs of what progress people want to make by riding a Harley.
Exactly right.
So.
Exactly right.
I think Aaron has a follow-up question. Aaron?
Yes. So going on with what Bob said, and Horace, what you were saying about Boston, I have the same feeling that the traffic is too much, and it's almost getting to the point where I would rather leave a city like that than deal with the traffic, because there's not a better way to get from point A to point B. So in terms of micromobility, how do you think that that will help cities stop from getting too big for their britches? I used to live in Washington, D.C., and it took me 35 minutes to go less than 3 miles to work. And so I've moved from urban area to urban area, and it's just like, makes people not want to come there. So even if the mayor's job to be done is create this wonderful city that people want to come live in, but traffic is such a problem, how do you think micromobility plays into that?
Again, this is a little bit outside my core, but it's interesting that people. One thing about America that strikes me is that people, when they get together, whether it's a party or even at work, or just occasionally around the office cooler, they start talking about traffic. Oh, when you ask where you live in Boston, the answer is not given in distance; it's given in time. I live 20 minutes north, or I live 30 minutes south. Or it's amazing how we've become so thought. Our thoughts and our the way we behave are driven by this constraint. I think Los Angeles is very similar as well. When you introduce a new thing, and you introduce even public transit, which I think is wonderful, but again, as I said, it doesn't solve all the problems. But when you introduce something new, people reframe everything, and suddenly they rethink. And so maybe it's a bike lane. And like in San Francisco, they opened up Market Street to cars. I mean, they closed it to cars, and now people are using it like crazy with bikes and other micro. Copenhagen, same thing. It's gone through a transformation where people now are feeling much more freedom in terms of their ability to go places and do things. And by the way, another indicator for the Nordics in Europe are that women are actually a majority of users. A small majority, it's like 55% or something like that. So in Denmark, in the Netherlands, it's more likely that women would use it. And it's done well, it's done right when women are the leaders. And the thing that I think attracts them is safety, is comfort. Even it's not weather, it's not that sort of comfort. They'll do it in the rain, they'll do it in the snow, but it's more like, I don't want to be hit by a car. And I think the separation of infrastructures is crucial. But as far as, I think people figure it out as soon as this will spread very quickly, because again, we are so constrained by traffic. So the idea that, hey, there's an option, there's an alternative, you should really try it, that'll go person to person. It won't have to be marketed. You won't have to run an ad campaign. The good systems are the ones who don't need advertising, whereas the bad systems need a lot of advertising. So the idea is that one of the things that micromobility founders have determined is that the system acts as its own advertising. It by putting the bikes on the street, for example, or the scooters on the street, they are visual ads. You see them and you know what they are, you know what they're for, and you don't have to spend money on customer acquisition. And that's a huge bonus, by the way. That's one less thing to pay for. And they advertise precisely to the person who is the customer, meaning the pedestrian or the urban transit user or the resident in the city core. And so in that sense, again, the idea is build it and they will come. And in so doing, they'll casually sort of transform the conversation in the city and transform people's perception of what is near and what is far. And they'll say, you're one scoot away, whatever that might mean. But basically, you're like, how far is something? It'll be like, it's an Uber ride away, it becomes, a jump away or a scoot away or a bird trip away. And that will evolve as time goes by. Hopefully that helps. That's just been my observation.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Rachel?
Hey, sorry, Katie, that was my hand still up. Let me just unraise my hand.
Oh, you don't have a question?
Not another one yet. Thank you.
Okay. I had one for you, Horace. I got your the newsletter today from Micromobility Industries, and the headline was "Lime could be broke by June." And I was wondering if you could just share your thoughts. I know I think you're doing a talk tomorrow on kind of micromobility in the context of coronavirus and
Yeah.
current crisis, but could you
So
just speak a little bit about that? Give us a preview.
yeah, so this has been, yeah, this has been considered a very it's been a very traumatic experience for a lot of businesses. I think a lot of the ride sharing businesses were in rather already a precarious state coming in. Usually winter is a tough time. Seasonality is bad. But also they weren't able to raise money as easily for this round as they were in the initial round. Now, again, I have to separate the micromobility. So, some people may be familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. So even though an S curve is very predictable, it sort of rises and saturates at a certain rate. When you look at the way capital flows into a system, it doesn't follow an S curve. It follows a huge exponential rise, then a collapse, and then a slow back rise up. And it's called the Gartner hype cycle, because as soon as information that there is a S curve appears, people start to want to be the ones who are going to win it. And so you have an oversupply of capital, a crisis moment where that capital is not getting a return, and so you have a trough of disillusionment, and then a plateau of productivity, and sort of that follows. And I don't know if anyone's written the equation for the Gartner hype cycle, but I know the S curve equation, and it's interesting to superimpose these two things. And so when you have a very fast S curve, you have a very fast hype cycle as well, because the hype cycle is trying to squeeze in the first 10%. You better have a winner in the first 10% of adoption, because that's who's going to take it all the way. As we saw with Amazon, that was the winner from the .com era, where there were thousands of online retailers. And even the car industry had thousands of automakers before Henry Ford nailed the production system. So the contenders were all out there. So in many ways, what we're seeing is very, very predictable, is that there was too much capital. It was poorly allocated. People were focused on the wrong metrics. I sort of was watching it. I was, expecting the S curve to emerge, but instead we ended up with this hype curve. And I had mixed feelings. I love the scooter companies, but in many ways they are rushing too fast into a model that's not sustainable. And I think the patient, one of Clay's favorites was this phrase that, be patient for profit. Be hungry for profit, be patient for growth. And VCs tend to be the opposite. And in some cases, the VC money is not the right money. It's not patient money. And in my experience, what I would have suggested early on were things like, I'm invested, obviously I have a bias, but I am invested sort of in e-bikes. And they didn't get a lot of capital. Maybe it's just going to take longer for them to become evident as a winning form factor. But it's really a lot of experiments have to fail before we know what the answer is. And now the virus itself may have accelerated things, but here's a couple of bright, silver linings, if you will. One, people are writing a lot more than they did before, whether it's private or not. It's still a lot more writing, and also in Europe. Secondly, I think that the data we're seeing on what are the reasons for doing this are less hygiene and more about control, and the problem with transit is that it is very, very potentially communicative diseases spread more easily, and car sharing. So we're seeing car sharing faring a lot worse than micromobility as a whole, and transit, that is also true. Again, the business models may struggle as we figure this out, but I also believe that fundamentally that this period is going to pass, and we're going to return to some normal behavior in the future. I hope so, anyway.
Great. Well, I think we can wrap up for the day. Thank you so much, Horace, for your time and for sharing your insights with all of us. And to everyone who joined the call, thank you very much. Yes, I see hands clapping.
Thank you, Horace. That was wonderful. Clay would have been, well, obviously we know he's sad to be missing all of this, but he would have enjoyed that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.